Hi guys, it's Debbie and today's topic is everything I watched this month. This way I will also be able to speak about all the films and series I didn't cover in my bigger standalone videos. Although I will not be able to dedicate the same amount of time for every single project, at least every work will have a tiny space in which I give a quick opinion, and this might also be a list of suggestions for movies you might want to watch or series you'd completely want to avoid. Because there's so many titles to cover, I will have to move through them quite quickly, but if I have spoken about these films or series in in-depth videos, you will find them linked on the screen. I wrote down the title of everything I watched, and I'm so glad I did this because by the end of the month I had already completely forgotten what I'd seen 30 days earlier. I watched quite a lot a month, but I'm pretty sure that if this were June or July, the numbers would be drastically less. It just depends on how much time I have, what I'm in the mood for, and also one good film is usually worth more than 10 bad films. But let's dive into this. My 2020 opened with Murder Mystery, a film I watched because Netflix kept on pushing it into my face. Every time I opened the app, the trailer for Murder Mystery would be playing. I would search for thrillers, Murder Mystery would be recommended. I would search for comedies, it would be the first recommendation. So I finally gave into the big brother and I decided to watch it. In Murder Mystery, Adam Sandler and Jennifer Aniston portray a couple who, during a wannabe romantic trip, end up on a yacht in France where a murder occurs, and everything seems to indicate that they could be the culprits. So they have to prove their innocence by investigating this case, during which many worse things happen. It's not a great film, but it's okay. I liked the Sandler-Aniston chemistry, but if you are looking for an old school style type of murder investigation with great storytelling, I would rather recommend watching Knives Out, which in January I actually rewatched with my mother because I enjoyed it so much. Briefly resumed, a murder occurs in an old mansion and everybody present on site seems to have a different reason for being the killer. So private detective Daniel Craig is hired to shine a light on the matters, which turned out to be way more complicated than expected. It's wonderful, it twists and turns right until a really engaging ending, which you probably never expected. Then at the beginning of the month, I watched an Indian film, Andhadhun. I enjoy watching Indian films, it's a little passion of mine. I reviewed a few of them here on my channel and I've been trying to watch more and more of them. And Andhadhun was actually a film you guys recommended over on Instagram, and when I looked at the trailer, it immediately caught my attention. As Westerners, we always seem to avoid Indian cinema. We seem to have this stereotyped division of what Indian cinema looks like, of these really long dance pieces and incredibly complicated love stories, but especially nowadays, a lot of times it's very far from the truth. For example, this film I watched, Andhadhun, is completely on the other end of the spectrum. It is the story of a blind pianist who is invited to perform a private session at a wealthy household where a murder has just occurred. This unwillingly drags him into everything that a murder entails, and the story just keeps on spiraling from there. It's pretty creepy. Another film I watched this January is one for which I had watched the trailer a while back, but which then I had completely forgotten about until I literally googled Best Films 2019 to see what I had missed, what I had skipped over, if there was anything good for me to watch. And as a matter of fact, one of the recommended titles was Skin, in which James Bell portrays a member of a neo-Nazi group. He is completely covered in offensive tattoos, he commits unspeakable actions. This is actually based on real life events, on a real person, so it is actually painful to watch. It's beautifully put together, it really conveys the hate that some people have towards fellow humans. The protagonist's life continues along this terrible road until he meets a nicer and quieter woman who influences him to be a better person. This woman is portrayed by Danielle MacDonald, who you might have seen in more famous works such as Bird Box. I love her. I think she has a ton of potential, and as a matter of fact, in the following weeks, I was looking up about her and I came across another film with her, this time as the protagonist, the main character, called Dumpling, and I decided to watch it. Dumpling in the film represents the character's childhood nickname, the name her mother likes to call her. In the film, she is the daughter of a former beauty queen in a town in which doing anything possible to win a beauty pageant is ridiculously important. As her character represents beauty beyond society's standards, she feels like her mother is disappointed with her, so as an act of rebellion, she decides to take part in her town's biggest beauty pageant. I love this film because it doesn't just say, "You're not pretty, but it's okay." It's more about being proud, being respectful, being a nice person in general. And a plus, it has an awesome Dolly Parton soundtrack. Amongst all these good films, one day I was in a very dark place and I decided that I needed some trashy films. And I realised, it came upon me, that I had never seen the 2016 version of Ghostbusters, the one with the all-women team. And I needed to watch it to see with my own eyes whether all the bad things people were saying about this film were true. And I don't know what I was expecting, because all the bad things that people have said about this film were indeed true. It's not so much about the fact that they had to remake it with women just for the sake of it, but the dialogues, the interaction, the cringe, it's not worth it. Right after that, I decided to watch Sausage Party, which for some odd reason I was totally convinced I had already seen in the past, but I hadn't. And I decided again to watch it based on my curiosity about reviews. And oddly enough, it wasn't as bad as I was expecting. It's more cheeky. This is a very R-rated, very mature animated film based on the concept that food is alive. It can think for itself. The film is set inside a supermarket in which every single food item has specific traits, and most of these are ridiculously stereotyped. The film makes fun of everyone and everything. So for example, the hot dogs are metaphors for penises who can't wait to go have sex with bread rolls who are super feminine and curvy. Then there is the Mexican food section, which includes illegal food. There is a Jewish bagel who is always getting into fights with the Middle Eastern lavash. There is a douche who is a douche. And this is without saying anything else that could get offensive. It was pushing the limits of what it could say and what it couldn't say. There were some moments in which I thought, did they really just say that? But I guess it's all in good spirit. That same evening I watched Ready or Not, a film which I had originally planned to go watch at the cinema back at the time when it came out, but I never ended up going, so it was about time to watch it. It's the story of a woman who marries into a very rich family, and on the first night of her wedding, she has to participate in a terrible game in which the whole family is trying to murder her. It's a sort of ritual they greatly believe in. So this woman has to escape and survive using every possible means. It's okay, rather predictable, it has a bit of a groan-worthy ending, it was nothing memorable, but I really enjoyed the acting on behalf of Samara Weaving, who portrays the bride, the protagonist, and I'm really interested in seeing more of her works. I know that she is in Picnic at Hanging Rock, which some of you have recommended, so I have to check it out. Something which was very memorable instead, it was Jojo Rabbit. Oh, how I've been going on about this film for what feels like a lifetime. I loved it so much. If you haven't seen Jojo Rabbit, go watch it. The film tells the story of a kid in Nazi Germany who is part of the Hitler Youth and who innocently believes there is some good to the Nazi regime. He even has a childish version of Hitler as his best friend. To show how absurd that regime was, the movie uses a lot of irony, and all the Nazis are some sort of failing dumb characters. Sam Rockwell and Rebel Wilson portray two of these soldiers, and all the Nazi ideology is portrayed as incredibly stupid, obviously. Instead, Scarlett Johansson portrays the main character's mother and the woman who tries to put some sense into his mind. She tries to show him the reality of things. This film is hilarious, but at the same time gut-wrenching. It had me laughing, it had me crying. Go watch it, you will not regret it. In January, I also got round to watching a film which Twitter had basically been trying to sell me as the best film of the year, Uncut Gems. in which Adam Sandler is a jeweler who is drowning in debts and troubles. He buys jewelry to then pawn it. He then uses the money to bet on sporting events to then repay his debts if he wins. It's a mess. And this time his biggest asset is an uncut gem he procured himself from a rural region of Africa, and which he is hoping will save him from all his financial troubles. The particular aspect of this film is that it is on a high. The whole film is running, shouting, gambling, moving money from one place to another, promising, cheating. It's a lot, but it keeps you on the edge of your seat right until the end. I don't agree with all the hype surrounding it that basically showed it as the best film since goodness knows when. But it is a good watch. It's by the Safdie brothers, and as I enjoyed Uncut Gems, I decided to watch another one of their films called Good Time, which also has a similar tone. Good Time's protagonist is Robert Pattinson, a criminal who gets his mentally disabled brother involved in his illegal activities, this time robbing a bank. When he manages to get away with the act, his brother is caught and jailed, even though his participation in the crime was rather against his will. So Pattinson's character does anything possible in order to get his brother out of jail, but this creates even more complicated circumstances. You know how I was saying that Uncut Gems was always on a high? It's the same for Good Time, and it's also a good example for all of those who still associate Robert Pattinson just with his role as Edward in Twilight. Around this time, I also watched something a little different, a TV series called Dracula. There's not much to say about it, it's the story of Dracula, but it's told under a Sherlock Holmes sort of perspective, with all the clever dialogues, the characters who always seem to display sexual tension. It's okay for the first hour, but it becomes a little too much after that. The dialogues are so heavy with clever answers, comebacks, innuendo that you just become bored with the whole situation. Then the effects were terrible. My only hope was that it was an intentional thing. Sorry, not worth the watch, although it was heavily advertised. Another film I watched on Netflix is The Two Popes, a film which honestly I only watched because of all the talk about it in regards to film awards. I don't think it would have been something I would have picked to watch otherwise. It's not my kind of thing. The story covers the real life Pope Ratzinger and his future successor and current Pope Bergoglio. They're portrayed by Anthony Hopkins and Jonathan Pryce, and the film covers the phase between their two lives as popes, their discussions about their responsibilities, about what being a pope requires, and so on. Okay, and now moving on, with a slight delay of 2 years, I finally watched Venom. Now, a few years back, when Venom appeared in Spider-Man 3, I loved him. The design really intrigued me. But then I never got around to actually seeing the whole 2018 film dedicated to him. Basically, Venom is an alien life form that latches onto a host, a person, and lives in symbiosis with this body, overpowering it when needed. So what I couldn't understand before watching this film was why the internet, especially platforms such as Tumblr, were dishing out dozens of illustrations portraying Eddie, Tom Hardy, and Venom under a very kawaii, cute perspective. I was very confused. Eventually my curiosity caught up with me and I watched it. It's not as bad as some people have been describing it, but I think it would have a bigger success with a young audience. It is rather cheesy, and also it's all about Venom and Eddie. I only watched this, like a couple of weeks ago, and I've already forgotten what the actual story was about, what the background action was about, so it's not that deep. On Amazon Prime instead, Amazon Prime Video, I watched a film with Adam Driver called The Report. This film is actually a pretty recent production based on a real-life investigation into abuse of power on behalf of the CIA when it came to interrogating potential terrorists, so the use of torture, the disappearance of evidence, and so on. It was pretty interesting to see, knowing that it was based on real life facts, and it was also interesting to see Adam Driver in a rather anonymous role. He is the protagonist here, but he was also a huge role as Kylo Ren. He had a big part in Marriage Story, whereas here he is smaller. It's a bit like his role in Black Klansman. I think this might be because he is just a little individual fighting against a huge institution such as the CIA. Then I watched watched another film based on real life events and which actually received a few nominations for the Oscars. This film speaks of a group of women who suffered sexual harassment on their workplace at a news station, Fox News, a famous American establishment. The women are portrayed by famous names such as Margot Robbie, who I absolutely loved here, Nicole Kidman and Charlize Theron. I think I would have enjoyed this film a bit more if I had more context about Fox News. I'm not speaking about the harassment story, that's a separate thing. What I'm talking about is that the film kind of gives for granted that we know about Fox News, about its political affiliations, about what kind of atmosphere there was at that news station. So for that reason, I felt I couldn't really relate, I couldn't enjoy it as much, but I did love the acting. Around this time, I decided to watch an older film called Heat, starring Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. I decided to include this film on today's list because it is a film I watched in January. But I felt that I needed to clarify that I will have to watch this film again in the future, because I don't know why, but my brain just wasn't working, it wasn't connected when I was watching it. I had to keep on skipping back in scenes, re-watching them. You know that moment when you're reading a book and you discover that you've just been rereading and rereading the same sentence without your brain absorbing anything? That's what happened with this film. The film is fine, it's not boring, it's pretty engaging. Al Pacino is a detective trying to track down criminal Robert De Niro, but they're both experts in their field. So I included it today, but I thought it was necessary to explain how I actually watched it. And I will keep you updated when I decide to watch it with a clearer mind. Now, remember at the beginning of this video when I said that Netflix kept on recommending murder mystery? Well, I believed that I could evade the Big Brother simply by watching the film, by watching Murder Mystery. Well, I was wrong, because since that moment, the streaming platform recommended a ton of other Adam Sandler films. And what did I do? I watched them. The first film I watched was The Week Of, a movie which has appalling reviews, but which I kind of enjoyed. It's the kind of film in which everything goes wrong, and you just laugh at that. It's silly. In this case, the situation that degenerates concerns the preparation for a big wedding involving a wealthy family and a much poorer family. The head of this family is Adam Sandler's character, who ends up hosting everybody at his house or putting people up in atrocious hotels. There are a lot of misunderstandings, accidents. It's just silly and funny. The other Adam Sandler film I watched is Funny People, in which he portrays a really famous comedian, a really famous actor, but who is diagnosed with a terminal illness. He is very down in the dumps, and during this time of his life he meets an aspiring comedian portrayed by Seth Rogen. They enter a very deep work/friendship relationship. They get into all sorts of odd situations, but while learning a lot about life. It's a bit long, it's a bit of a slow burner, but it's okay. But if I had to recommend between this film and The Week Of, I actually preferred The Week Of. And as we are speaking about comedy, in addition to the Adam Sandler situation on Netflix, the same happened with Ricky Gervais. I had been meaning to watch his series Afterlife for quite a while, but then the Golden Globes happened, his speech went absolutely viral, and obviously Netflix started pushing the series, and I ended up watching it. Afterlife is the story of a guy who, after years of wonderful marriage, loses his wife to cancer. Because of this, he is incredibly depressed and seriously considers committing suicide. While he toys with this idea, he decides to cope with his life in the meanwhile by behaving however he pleases. This includes him being particularly rude, arrogant, disrespectful to others, because it makes him feel a little better about himself. This series actually turned out to be pretty deep. There are some scenes in which I actually had to pause the video to have a think about what had just been said. I've always thought about this about Ricky Gervais's comedy. There's always something a little deeper going on, even with the silliest jokes. Of course, as soon as I finished that, the Big Brother arrived, basically recommending all of Ricky Gervais's filmography, and I ended up watching another one of his films called The Invention of Line, which is actually based on a very simple but genius idea: a society in which lying doesn't exist. People don't even have the concept of being able to lie. They just walk around saying anything that goes through their minds. It's rib cracking. Then one day a guy lies, but he soon realizes how that simple act can change everything, and that one simple lie snowballs into a world-changing situation. I'm not going to say much else because this film is best seen without knowing anything about what is going to happen. Also by Ricky Gervais, I watched Special Correspondent. It's not as great, it's very simple, it's just a quick watch, and it speaks about two journalists who really mess up at work and they lose their one and only possibility, their one and only chance to go all the way to Ecuador to document a huge revolution that's happening there. To not lose their job, but to not get in trouble, they close themselves in the building on the other side of the street from their workplace, and they pretend that they're in Ecuador from there. Obviously, this creates a lot of funny situations. It's okay, it's not as funny as other works. For example, if I had to recommend something, I would recommend in this case The Invention of Lying. To be honest, I actually picked Special Correspondence because I was desperately looking for something to get my mind off of a terrible TV series I'd seen spinning out. I documented my rage-fueled experience on social media because it took me over a week just to watch a few episodes of this series. It was so bad. It's the story of an incredibly dysfunctional family in which the two daughters are promising ice skaters, but who are trying their best to become champions in their line of sporting. But the story is not so much about the skating itself, it's about all the drama surrounding the rink. Cheating, fighting, escaping, and it all happens within like 10 characters. It's really a teen drama but with adults, and it has the worst dialogues. It was unbearable. The series tries to give it a bit of a more serious tone because it drags into it the problem of mental illness, but that was fine. That's not the problem with the series. The problem was the atrocious dialogues, the stiffness between the characters, and the fact that this tiny snowy town has more action than the Fast and Furious films. I then watched a series of films which surprised me positively. The first one was Swiss Army Man. Now, I actually knew this was supposed to be a good film. I'd read some really positive reactions about this movie, but for some reason my mind couldn't manage to combine those reactions with a trailer in which a guy stranded on a random island finds a corpse and uses it in different ways, such as a jet ski propelled by its farts, or he uses his erect penis as a sort of GPS tracker. I just couldn't manage to associate those two facts together. But then I watched the film and I understood why so many people liked it. I actually cried a lot by the end of it. It's the kind of film that needs to be watched with an open mind. It's not about Paul Dano using Daniel Radcliffe's dead body as a Swiss Army knife. It goes much deeper on a philosophical level. I'm not going to say much more about it to not ruin the experience if you haven't seen it yet, because it's best watched with an open, clear mind. Another film which surprised me was Astra, which, although I am a huge space fan, had never been something I had picked to watch. Brad Pitt portrays an excellent astronaut who is sent off to discover more about a mysterious program set up by his father, also an astronaut. But this mission, of course, unveils much more than anticipated. I don't know why, but I expected this film to be a huge action flick. Was it Brad Pitt? I have no clue. I just don't know. But in the end, it turned out to be way more introspective than forecast. Still, if I had to recommend something, I would recommend a million times more Interstellar, depicted behind me here. But it was still interesting to see something different. Now, in the midst of all these good films, I had my 16-year-old moment and I watched 5 Feet Apart. Do you remember The Fault in Our Stars? It was a book and film released a few years back, and it spoke about teenagers who were dealing with cancer, with relapsing, with beating it, and it was a love story, and basically everybody that watched it would walk away from it bawling their eyes out. I decided to watch 5 Feet Apart, which doesn't have anything to do with The Fault in Our Stars, but it still follows along the same lines. As a matter of fact, it depicts a love story between two teenagers fighting cystic fibrosis. Because of their condition, they have to stay far away from other people to avoid being infected and potentially dying. I actually also watched this because I used to follow Claire Wineland, who was here on YouTube. She was fighting cystic fibrosis. And although she knew that she didn't have the same life expectancy as other people, she still had such a cheerful and positive attitude towards life. And she made me think so much about how entitled I was, how I was behaving in regards to my own life. So 5 Feet Apart was something that was tickling my curiosity. But I think this is a film which is fine if you're a teenager looking for struggling love, something a little more deeper. I know it's based on a real life story. Unfortunately, I am not familiar with the names or the lives of the people on which this film is actually based. I know it's trying to send a deeper message to young audiences, but if I have to take this film and look at it purely on a filmmaking level, it's not that good. It's mostly just these super perfect, good-looking people, Cole Sprouse and Haley Lu Richardson, who meet and have these very cliched dialogues. We're nearly at the end of what I watched this month. Next, I watched a few Italian films. Actually, the first... one of these Italian films is the first film I watched out of the whole year because I watched it 10 minutes after midnight. So even before Murder Mystery, it opened up my 2020, and it is called Tolo Tolo. It is the comedic story of an Italian guy who ends up in a poor region of Africa where he meets many new people, where he discovers what a life in poverty looks like, what people there think of Italians, etc. This film was immensely popular on the one hand because the main character is portrayed by a very famous Italian comedian known by his stage name of Chicco Zalone. On the other hand, because in recent years there have been huge waves of immigration into Italy from the African continent, and this has sparked a huge discussion surrounding the policies about immigration, political asylums, work permits, and there have been huge new waves of racism. So this film, covering related topics, sparked a lot of curiosity. Even the trailer was just a music clip in which a stereotypical migrant from North Africa asks for monies outside supermarkets or gas stations. He makes Italian women fall for him. He makes fun of the protagonist, who eventually loses his patience and starts to look like Mussolini, the dictator. Of course, this was all meant to just spark interest towards the film. The other Italian film I watched is Benvenuto Presidente, starring another famous Italian comedian. The title translated means Welcome President, and the story covers those instances in which people go to vote, and instead of picking between picking one of the potential candidates, they write a totally different name, usually as a form of protest. In this film, the name that many people write is Giuseppe Garibaldi, a famous figure in Italian history. But so many people write Giuseppe Garibaldi that because of various law loopholes, Giuseppe Garibaldi has to be elected President of Italy, basically one of the highest powers in the country. And out of all the Giuseppe Garibaldis in Italy, there is only one guy that meets the necessary requirements of age, criminal record, etc. But he is a small town fisherman whose knowledge of political affairs is very limited. Of course, hilarity ensues. The third Italian movie I watched was actually the last film I watched in January, and of which I actually watched twice, once my own and once with my family. It's by a famous comedy trio, Aldo, Giovanni and Giacomo, who used to be incredibly famous a few years back, but then because of a series of mediocre projects, started to lose a lot of their popularity. But this year they returned with a new film called Odio l'estate, which translated means I hate summer. In the film, they all have very different backgrounds. There's the fancy Milan family, the passionate, expansive family from the south of Italy, the family struggling financially, but they all end up booking the same holiday house for the same time frame, so they all have to share it with all their differences. And of course it happens during the summer holidays, a sacred moment for all Italians. Needless to say, we were all pleased to see the three comedians finally back in a worthwhile project. Then what else did I watch? I watched a couple of Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg films. The first one of the two was Daddy's Home, in which Will Ferrell is the goofy, good-at-heart stepfather who's doing his best to be the perfect dad to his stepchildren, while Mark Wahlberg is the cool motorbike rider biological dad who's trying to weasel his way back into the family, basically creating a competition between the two dads. The other film I watched with the same two actors is The Other Guys, in which both Ferrell and Wahlberg portray police officers. Again, Will Ferrell being the less streetwise one. They team up but end up creating even more disasters than the ones they should be fixing. It reminded me a little of Pain and Gain. It had the same ironic vibe, still not on the same level though. I then already watched a really random 1998 film which looks a little like the kind of thing your weird cousin's friend would burn on a dodgy DVD and lend you for a week. It's called Wild Things, and it's the complicated story of a police investigation into a teacher who supposedly molested his students, only to then reveal that there's a much bigger story behind that. The whole thing goes way deeper. I don't really know how to take this film, but I think Rotten Tomatoes summed it up well with a sentence. Wild Things is a delightfully salacious, flesh-exposed romp that also requires a high degree of love for trash cinema. I then watched The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, the Swedish version. I'd actually already started this film multiple times in the past without ever finishing it, so I was glad I actually watched it all the way to the end, and I pretty much enjoyed it. The story is based on the first of 3 humongous Swedish novels, which were then also adapted into an American film saga starring Daniel Craig and Rooney Mara. The story, both in the Swedish and American version, is an investigation into the disappearance of a woman, but which ends up uncovering a lot more than expected. In addition to the gripping storyline, these films and books received a lot of attention, also because of one character in particular, Lisbeth Salander, an alternative hacker with a mysterious past who joins in to help with the investigation. Then, as my need of humour wasn't over with all the comedies I watched this month, I also watched Year One with Jack Black and Michael Cera as 2 primitive guys who move away from the village, and as they do so, they meet various steps in human evolution and mythologies. So they get to know new inventions, new lifestyles, they meet characters from the Bible, all with a heavy dose of irony. Although it was hilarious, towards the end it started to get a little boring and repetitive, but the first half was fantastic. And then the last film on this never-ending list is I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore. A mouthful of a title, but a very quirky and unexpectedly fun film in which your average neighbourhood woman, who anonymously bends in the background, is distraught after her house is visited by burglars and a lot of her possessions are stolen, including her computer and, more importantly, her grandma's silverware. She sets off on a mission to retrieve her belongings with her weird neighbour, portrayed by Elijah Wood, who acts as if he were a sort of ninja thug. But the more they try to set things straight, the more this duo creates other unwanted situations. This is actually not a straightforward comedy, but there's so many scenes which really make you laugh, but in that kind of snorting out of your nostrils laughter, if that makes any sense. And that is that. That is everything I watched in January. If you're still watching, thank you so much for sticking all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to hear your opinions about all the topics we covered today, so make sure to leave a comment down below with all your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in the next video. Bye.